From the atomic ashes of 1945, Japan gave the world two children. One is a story you've probably never heard. It's about a little boy sitting in the ruins of Hiroshima who, when asked if he was angry, just pointed to the sky and said, "Look, the moon still shines for all of us." He became a quiet symbol of grace, known as the Moonlight Boy. But the second child born from that same fire is one you definitely know. He wasn't quiet. He was a city-leveling roar, a monster of pure radiation and rage, a walking metaphor for humanity's greatest sin. His name was Godzilla.
Godzilla, yeah.
One represents a path of forgiveness, the other a scream for remembrance that can never be silenced. How can a single moment of absolute horror create two symbols so radically opposed?
It's an incredible question.
And what does the quiet boy and the raging monster tell us about the two ways we all choose to deal with our own apocalypses?
That dichotomy, it's perfect for this deep dive.
Yeah.
The quiet grace versus this, well, catastrophic rage. Our mission today is really to unpack exactly how Japan, facing this absolutely unprecedented national trauma, created these radically different cultural symbols. It's how they process their collective memory.
Right, two different paths.
Exactly. We're tracking two parallel paths here. One is about seeking quiet acceptance, maybe mediated justice, which you see embodied culturally in figures like the masked hero Gekko Kamen. He's sort of the spiritual successor to that Moonlight Boy idea.
Okay.
And then, at the same time, you have the other path, the raw manifestation of unchecked technological terror and, frankly, rage in Gojira. And underpinning this whole thing, well, it's the heavy ethical culpability of the science that birthed this whole new destructive age.
It's fascinating because it's more than just, two characters. It feels like two entirely different national coping mechanisms playing out. How do you recover from a wound that specific, that unique? Do you try to absorb it, find some universal moral truth like the Moonlight Boy? Or do you just externalize the horror, let it roar like Godzilla?
And before we even get to the cultural artifacts themselves, we really have to understand the moment, don't we?
Yeah.
The crucible of crisis, where the atomic age was actually forged. And the moral compromises made in that fire.
We have to start with the scientists, the people who actually designed this apocalypse.
Yeah, the sources are really clear on this. There was a profound, almost immediate moral conflict bubbling up within the Manhattan Project. I mean, these were brilliant people, incredibly driven, who suddenly had this horrifying realization. They weren't just inventors anymore. They were midwives to death, the destroyer of worlds, as Oppenheimer put it.
And that's the truly tragic part, looking back. The scientific conscience did speak up, quite loudly, in fact. But the political machine, well, it just wasn't listening.
Precisely. The first really major attempt to sound the alarm came in June 1945. It was the Franck Report, named after the Nobel laureate Dr. James Franck. Now, the scientists involved, they weren't arguing against ending the war. That's not the point. They were arguing against the way the bomb might be used, specifically the surprise use.
Against civilians?
Against the civilian population, without warning. They explicitly told the government this was, quote, inadvisable and immoral.
And it wasn't just about the morality of that single act, was it? They had a bigger picture in mind, something strategic for the post-war world.
Absolutely. They saw the long game. They understood that dropping this thing without any warning would basically forfeit any moral high ground the U.S. might have had later when trying to control nuclear weapons globally.
Ah, so it was about future proliferation.
Yes. The report actually suggested a non-lethal demonstration first, maybe on an uninhabited island, for international observers. Show the power. Encourage Japan's surrender, but keep a path open for international control. Limit the arms race before it even properly began. They felt controlling proliferation was vastly more critical than the shock value of a surprise attack.
Well, that recommendation just got dismissed.
Pushed aside. And then, just a month later, July 1945, you get the Szilard petition. Leo Szilard, ironically, the guy who first pushed Roosevelt to start the atomic project.
He led this one.
He did. He and nearly 70 other scientists signed it. They declared that dropping the bomb without first giving Japan clear surrender terms and a final explicit warning, it was simply unjustified.
Citing moral responsibility again.
Deep moral responsibilities, especially using a weapon that could, instantly wipe out hundreds of thousands of non-combatants. Yeah. But this petition, well, it was essentially suppressed. It never even reached President Truman.
Wow.
It's a devastating historical what if. A moment where the creators' ethical anxieties were just completely overridden by immediate military and political goals.
And that sense of consequence, that weight, It's perfectly captured in J. Robert Oppenheimer's reaction after the Trinity test, that first successful detonation out in New Mexico.
Yeah, the WWII quote.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That's not celebratory. That sounds like sheer terror at what they'd done.
It's a moment of pure shared accountability, I think. The scientists knew the magnitude of what they'd collectively unleashed, even as the political system was already figuring out how to deploy it. And this profound realization, this scientific consequence. It's why later, when you look at the cultural symbols like Godzilla, a scientist character is almost always the conflicted conscience.
Okay, so the scientists had these deep reservations, but the U.S. government moved forward. Let's unpack the reasons they gave, the arguments for necessity, the pro-bombing view.
Well, the primary argument, the one driving the decision at the highest levels, was about preventing massive, truly massive casualties in the planned invasion of Japan itself, Operation Downfall.
Right, the invasion of the home islands.
Exactly. Planners genuinely believed the Japanese military, driven by the Bushido Code and, frankly, fanaticism, would fight tooth and nail, house to house. The estimates at the time were just grim. Projections of up to 1 million American casualties, maybe 250,000 British.
And Japanese casualties would have been astronomical.
Potentially running into the millions, both military and civilian. So the argument was, use the bomb, end the war quickly, prevent that even greater bloodbath.
And it wasn't solely focused on Allied lives, was it? There was also an argument about ending the suffering elsewhere in Asia.
That's a crucial context. You have to remember the sheer horror of the ongoing Pacific War. Sources point to the staggering scale of atrocities, famine, just widespread death in Japanese-occupied territories.
Like in China.
For instance, yeah. In China alone, estimates suggest somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people were dying every month between 37 and 45. So the rationale was, look, expediting the end of the war, even with a weapon this terrible, would ultimately save more lives across Asia than letting the conventional war grind on for potentially many more months.
There's also the context of total war within Japan itself. That made conventional bombing incredibly difficult, didn't it? Distinguishing targets.
It made it practically impossible to separate military targets from civilian populations. Japan had mobilized everyone. Over 90% of its war production wasn't in big factories. It was dispersed among unmarked residential neighborhoods, relying on small cottage industries.
So any conventional bombing campaign aimed at industry
would inevitably cause mass civilian death. And we saw that. March 1945, firebombing of Tokyo, Operation Meeting House. That killed around 100,000 people in one night. That single conventional raid was actually more lethal than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki initially.
But hang on. If you use the logic of total war to justify bombing population centers, doesn't that kind of undermine the moral objections raised by Schiller and Frank? They were specifically warning against targeting civilians, regardless of the difficulties.
And that's the core, the unresolvable tension, isn't it? You have the military context justifying the action based on projected outcomes, saving lives, ending the war faster. Utilitarian almost. Yeah. Then you have the scientists' objections, rooted in what they saw as an immutable moral principle. You just don't cross the line into deliberately wiping out civilians for psychological or political gain. The two sides were fundamentally speaking different languages.
Which leads us straight into the counter-argument, the view that the bombs weren't actually militarily necessary at all. The 1946 Strategic Bombing Survey often comes up here.
Yes, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. They concluded in 46, looking back, that Japan would likely have surrendered by November or December 1945 anyway.
Without the bombs.
Without the bombs, yes. Due to the incredibly effective naval blockade cutting off supplies and the relentless conventional bombing campaign. They even suggested surrender would have happened without Soviet entry into the war. And this wasn't just a civilian report. High-ranking military figures like Fleet Admiral William Leahy agreed. He famously called the bombs of no material assistance.
But then there's the timing, the geopolitics. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria on August 8th. That's just 3 days after Hiroshima. Some historians argue that was the real trigger for surrender.
That perspective carries a lot of weight, and you see it debated heavily in the sources. The argument is that Japan's military hardliners weren't necessarily terrified of more American destruction. They'd endured firebombings after all.
Yeah.
What truly terrified them was the Soviet invasion.
Why specifically the Soviets?
The prospect of a Soviet occupation, potentially of Hokkaido, the northern island, Japan feared that Soviet occupation would fundamentally destroy the foundation of the nation and, critically, eliminate any chance of preserving the emperor's position, which was paramount. So in this view, the atomic bombs didn't force the surrender so much as they provided a convenient, face-saving excuse for the Japanese government to finally accept the Potsdam Declaration terms and surrender to the Americans rather than risk being carved up or dominated by the Soviets.
So if military necessity wasn't the absolute sole driver, that brings us into the darker territory of atomic diplomacy.
And this is where the debate gets really charged. The argument here is that the bombings were essentially a form of state terrorism, that civilians were targeted intentionally, not just to break Japanese morale, but for a psychological effect on a global stage.
To make a statement.
To make the debut of this weapon sufficiently spectacular, as the interim committee documents suggest, for the importance of the weapon to be internationally recognized.
And the key international audience wasn't Japan anymore. It was Moscow. Joseph Stalin.
Precisely. Remember the timing. The wartime alliance that defeated Nazi Germany was already fracturing even before VJ Day. Truman and his advisors were deeply worried about Soviet post-war ambitions, especially in Eastern Europe and Asia.
So showing off the bomb
was seen as a crucial diplomatic tool, a way to intimidate Moscow, assert U.S. dominance in the New World Order, and basically set the terms of the peace in both Europe and Asia. This terrifying display of power wasn't just the end of World War II, it was arguably the opening shot of the Cold War.
And if that geopolitical goal was primary, it makes the timing of the second bomb Nagasaki just 3 days after Hiroshima almost impossible to justify purely militarily. They hadn't even fully assessed the damage in Hiroshima yet.
Critics rightly point that out. Some call the Nagasaki bombing gratuitous at best and genocidal at worst. However, the sources suggest the rationale for that speed, that terrible urgency, was specifically aimed at the Japanese military hardliners.
To prevent them from downplaying the first bomb.
Exactly. War Minister Anami, for instance, initially refused to even believe the Hiroshima bomb was atomic. He apparently suggested it could have been a natural disaster, a meteor, or just a lucky conventional hit.
So they needed immediate proof it wasn't a one-off?
Yes. The speed was designed to prove the U.S. didn't just have a bomb, but an arsenal, that they could keep doing this. Tragically, in those final cabinet meetings, there's evidence Japanese military leaders were even fed disinformation that the U.S. had 100 bombs ready, could drop 3 a day. That kind of psychological pressure finally crushed the resistance to surrender.
So the surrender comes under extreme duress, maybe even based on false information, just days after the second bomb. Japan emerges from this unique crucible of horror. A sense of scientific betrayal, deep moral ambiguity about the surrender itself, and trauma unlike anything else. How does a culture even start to process that?
And it takes time. It took 9 years for the first, loudest, most visceral answer to really emerge in popular culture. 1954, a giant radioactive miner called Godzilla. And that transition from the historical event to the cultural metaphor, it's absolutely vital. Gojira is the collective Japanese trauma-made flesh or scales or whatever he is, an immediate raw reaction against this terrifying new age of nuclear power.
The 1954 film, the original Japanese one, it wasn't exactly subtle about it, was it?
Not at all. It was explicitly conceived as an anti-nuclear metaphor. It came directly from Japan's unique, terrible status as the only nation to suffer atomic attacks. Even the name, Gojira, supposedly a blend of gorilla and Kujira, whale, that's less important than his origin story.
He's born from the bomb.
Awakened by H-bomb testing, mutated, sustained by nuclear energy. The sources even point out this kind of cosmological horror baked into it. Godzilla's energy, the film implies, is the same primal force, the nuclear fire, that powers the stars.
Wow.
So the monster links humanity's greatest scientific leap, understanding atomic power directly with its greatest sin. It turns cosmic energy into street-level annihilation.
And the imagery during his rampage through Tokyo, that wasn't just random destruction. It was designed to tap into very specific, very recent memories for the audience.
We have to understand that trauma. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the nuclear terror, yes. But for many Tokyo residents, the recurring nightmare, the more immediate visceral memory, was the conventional terror of the 1945 firebombings, especially Operation Meeting House in March 45.
The one that created the firestorm?
Exactly. A terrifying firestorm that literally sucked the oxygen out of the air, boiled rivers. When Godzilla breathes his atomic heat ray and sets Tokyo ablaze in the film, the dialogue deliberately connects those dots.
I remember reading that characters fleeing actually say things like, "The shelters again, that stinks." directly linking this monster attack to the wartime routine of terror.
Yes. And during the climax, there's that famous line from a reporter, "Right now, Godzilla is leaving behind a sea of flame. From Ginzawari to Shimbashi, Tamachi, Chiba, and Shinobara, it's all become a sea of flames." That's not just dramatic movie dialogue.
It's mapping the trauma.
It's a direct invocation of the specific geography and the unimaginable horror of that March 1945 firestorm, people literally boiling in canals. So Godzilla, in that original context, wasn't just some fantasy creature. He was the radioactive ghost of their very recent past, come back to haunt them.
And the film's moral center isn't the government or the military. It's the scientist, Dr. Serizawa. He feels like the personification of that Japanese anti-nuclear stance, representing the complete loss, not just of life, but of faith in science itself.
Serizawa is such a crucial figure. He's almost the tragic answer to the Manhattan Project's ethical failures. He's created something incredibly powerful and destructive, the oxygen destroyer.
And he keeps it secret?
He keeps it secret, refuses to use it, because he's terrified of how humans, especially politicians in the military, would inevitably weaponize it. He explicitly says it. Bombs versus bombs, missiles versus missiles, and now a new super weapon to throw upon us all. He sees the inevitable escalation.
He sees science just leading to perpetual annihilation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So his final act, his sacrifice, destroying Godzilla, yes, but also destroying himself and taking the secret of the oxygen destroyer with him. That's the film's profound ethical statement.
He breaks the cycle.
He refuses to let science provide another tool for mass destruction. It's like the scientific conscience choosing self-erasure over further contribution to the arms race. And then Dr. Yamane hammers it home in the final lines, warning that if nuclear testing continues,
another Godzilla might appear.
The message couldn't be more direct. It's a plea, a warning.
It's interesting, though, that despite how powerful and resonant these themes clearly were for the public, the initial critical reaction in Japan was kind of mixed.
Yeah, reviewers seemed a bit unsure what to make of it. Some found the story, told quite poorly, or even called it a comedic farce. Perhaps they were expecting something more traditionally artistic, more highbrow, as a response to the trauma.
But the audience got it.
Oh, the audience absolutely got it. It was a huge box office success. It cost around 62 million yen, grossed over 150 million. The public saw their raw, unprocessed trauma reflected in that city-leveling roar. That immediate connection cemented Godzilla's place in cultural history.
Okay, so if Godzilla represents that primal scream, that raw confrontation with the trauma, where was the other response? The quieter path, the attempt to rebuild, maybe find a different kind of justice? That brings us back to the other child of the ashes, or at least his cultural successor, Gekkamen, Moonlight Mask.
Right, and this is really the antithesis of Godzilla in many ways, where Godzilla is this raw, unrestrained, purely Japanese eruption of trauma. Gekkamen represents an effort to assimilate, to adopt an external, almost mediated form of justice.
He debuted in 1958, right? Japan's first TV superhero.
First TV superhero, yeah. And he was deliberately, explicitly modeled on American heroes. The creators looked at things like the Lone Ranger Superman.
That desire to imitate Western heroism. It says so much about the post-war identity crisis, doesn't it? Trying to find a moral compass that wasn't tainted by the war itself.
Absolutely. And the key thing about Gekkamen was his anonymity. Total anonymity. The audience never learned his real name, his backstory, his specific motivations.
Why was that so important?
Because it tapped into those deep post-war ambiguities about justice. After the defeat, the occupation, the new constitution imposed from outside, many Japanese felt alienated from the concept of justice. It felt like Victor's justice.
Foreign, imposed, not really theirs.
Exactly. Unlocatable without a Japanese face.
So the idea that Gekkamen's mask meant anyone could be Gekkamen, that offered a powerful kind of hope. Maybe by donning this external mask, by adopting this Western-style, morally unambiguous virtue, the nation could somehow fill the void, restore the sense of justice that felt lost or corrupted. The hero was a vessel.
And his actual mission, his slogan, it was aimed squarely at healing those war wounds. Don't hate, don't kill, forgive. I mean, think about that message in the late 50s, just over a decade after the war's end. It's a direct plea for reconciliation, delivered by this mysterious, masked figure who, ironically, carried pistols and a whip.
But the medium itself, television, was so new and powerful, and that led to problems, this copycatism phenomenon.
Oh, yeah, moho. Gekkyo Kamen was insanely popular, hitting viewership over 60%, and it sparked a genuine moral panic.
Because kids were imitating him.
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
We're talking about real-world injuries, even deaths. Children trying to mimic the hero's feats, especially jumping from high places, roofs, balconies. It was called Gekko Kamen, Goko Gekko Kamen, make-believe. It got dangerous.
How did people try to understand that at the time, psychologically?
Well, contemporary analysis, people like Terada Seiichi, Namakawa Mimichio, they framed it as this conflict. You had the intense strength of children's mimicry, their natural urge to imitate, clashing with the perceived weakness of their mental capacity for resistance. They just couldn't resist the allure of the power the mask seemed to offer.
But wasn't there more to it than just simple imitation? I read something about a competitive angle.
Yes, and that's a crucial layer. It wasn't just kids imitating the hero, the external mediator. It was also kids imitating each other, internal mediators, in this escalating game of daredevilry, of one-upmanship.
Ah, peer pressure meets superhero fantasy.
Exactly. Pushing the boundaries of pretend further and further until it crossed into real physical danger. So the attempt to internalize this external idealized justice ironically led to this internal tragic rivalry among peers.
So philosophically, this masked hero became a real symbol, but also a battleground.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Hanada Kiyotaro actually argued that the mask itself was the truth of post-war justice. That justice had to be masked because it was unlocatable, ambivalent, imposed like a gale force wind from the west. For him, the truth wasn't hidden behind the mask. The mask was the necessary adopted truth for a nation grappling with moral compromise.
But when the tragedies happened, the injuries and deaths, society needed someone or something to blame.
And they found scapegoats. Right. Initially, it was the medium itself. Television was new, disruptive. It was blamed for corrupting youth, undermining tradition.
The classic moral panic about new media.
Right. But as TV became more embedded, more indispensable, the blame shifted more onto the content. Gekko Kamen itself took the fall and was eventually canceled. But that scapegoating also revealed deeper tensions.
Like what?
Like the rivalry between different groups vying for influence. Educators, politicians, producers of older media like film and radio. They perhaps feared losing their grip on shaping the values of the nation's youth to this powerful, popular, and very westernized new medium.
Still, despite the cancellation, the character stuck around in the culture.
Oh, absolutely indelible. He became this enduring metaphor for justice. Maybe a slightly ambiguous justice, but justice nonetheless. You'd see him invoked decades later by politicians, activists. That quiet acceptance, symbolized by the Moonlight Boy, had evolved into this active, masked attempt to find and embody virtue in a radically changed world.
It really shows a culture trying to fill a huge moral vacuum left by the war.
Powerful demonstration, yes.
Okay, so if Gekko Kamen was about Japan looking outward, trying to borrow virtue from the West, we need to flip the coin and look at what happened when the West took Japan's trauma narrative and made it its own. Let's talk about the Great Transformation. Gojira goes west.
Yes, and this is a fascinating story of cultural reinterpretation, maybe even appropriation, all seen through the specific lens of American Cold War anxiety. So, the original 1954 Gojira arrives in the U.S. in 1956.
And it gets a makeover. New title, Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
Joko TM.
Yeah.
And it was drastically re-edited. The single biggest change, the most crucial one, was inserting an American character, the reporter Steve Martin, played by Raymond Burr.
So the perspective shifts completely.
Entirely. Suddenly, this Japanese tragedy is viewed primarily through the eyes of a Western observer, and critically, almost all the explicit references to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the H-bomb test, they were systematically scrubbed out, excised.
The anti-nuclear scream was silenced. Why? What was the thinking there?
Context is everything. This was 1950s America. The height of the Cold War, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, HUAC investigations. The Rosenbergs had recently been executed for allegedly stealing atomic secrets.
So anything critical of nuclear weapons
Could be seen as politically dangerous, subversive, even potentially sympathetic to the Soviet Union. The dominant American anxiety at that moment wasn't about the morality of having used the bomb, like in Japan. It was about the Soviets having detonated their own bomb in 1949. It was about the terrifying loss of America's nuclear monopoly.
So questioning the bomb itself felt like questioning America's core defense strategy against communism.
Precisely. One of the American producers, Richard Kay, later claimed he wasn't interested in politics, but let's be realistic. To survive and profit in Hollywood back then, you avoided overtly challenging fundamental government policy. especially nuclear policy. Any anti-nuclear message had to be subtle, subliminal, or maybe just reframed entirely.
But here's the really interesting twist. Despite censoring the original Japanese message, the American edit, GKOTM, somehow ended up aligning, perhaps inadvertently, with the message of the most prominent American anti-nuclear group at the time.
The Federation of Atomic Scientists, the FAS.
Yes.
This is the really deep connection we wanted to explore. The FAS was largely made up of scientists who had actually worked on the Manhattan Project. People like Szilard, Oppenheimer, others.
The guys who knew exactly what they'd created.
And having seen it, they were terrified, not just of the weapon itself, but of the geopolitical chaos, the arms race it would unleash. They published that seminal warning collection, One World or None, trying desperately to educate the public and policymakers about the existential danger.
Okay, so how did GKOTM, the Americanized Godzilla, end up mirroring the FAS themes, even without the Hiroshima references?
Well, a few ways. Firstly, through the role of the scientist. In the American version, Steve Martin's collaborative relationship with Dr. Serizawa, it kind of mirrors the FAS's own urgent efforts to stay connected with the media, with the public, to get their warnings out.
Serizawa becomes the symbol of the conflicted scientist for the American audience, too.
Exactly. He embodies that FAS dilemma perfectly.
Yeah.
Nuclear power has potential, sure, but its destructive side is just too dangerous, too easily misused by panicked governments or militaries. Serizawa's internal struggle resonates with the FAS's public warnings.
And the way Godzilla destroys things, that aligned with FAS analysis, too. You mentioned saturation.
Yes. Key FAS figures like Philip Morrison, another Manhattan Project veteran, analyzed the effects of nuclear weapons. They contrasted it with conventional bombing. A massive firebombing raid like Tokyo might achieve total destruction in one concentrated area.
Right, obliteration.
But nuclear weapons, they argued, cause saturation. The destruction isn't necessarily total everywhere, but it's widespread. It causes systemic collapse, incapacitation, especially through heat, blast, and crucially, radiation over a much larger area. It overwhelms everything.
And that description, it fits Godzilla's rampage in GKOTM perfectly.
Absolutely perfectly. The monster doesn't just flatten Tokyo into dust, which might imply simple, total annihilation. Instead, his destruction is pervasive. It spreads. It leaves survivors, yes, but they're in a state of shock. Infrastructure is crippled, government paralyzed. It saturates the city with fear and chaos. The FAS scientists were basically describing Godzilla's impact profile years before the monster was even Americanized.
Which connects to the second big FAS theme you found reflected, unendurable fear.
Right. Listen to Steve Martin's narration in GKOTM. It's constantly emphasizing the paralyzing fear that it could happen again today or tomorrow. That phrase, that feeling, that was the absolute core of the FAS warning.
That the bomb itself created this new psychological state.
Yes, a massive, unendurable level of fear and anxiety that would inevitably poison decision-making. It would lead to irrational, desperate actions by politicians, by the military, driven by the sheer terror of potential annihilation.
I remember the scene where Martin pleads with Emiko, Serizawa's fiancée, who knows about the oxygen destroyer. He says something like, "Emiko, last night Tokyo was destroyed. Tomorrow it might be Osaka or Yokohama. If you can help, you must."
Exactly. Godzilla, the bomb metaphor in this version, creates mass paranoia because his existence means sudden, overwhelming death could strike anywhere, anytime, without effective defense.
And that constant fear drives what another FAS scientist, Nobel laureate Harold Urey, called unreasonable decision-making?
Precisely. So the American re-edit, GKOTM, it succeeds in a way, but not by preserving the original Japanese trauma message. It succeeds by transforming Godzilla into this potent, if maybe unintentional metaphor for America's own internal Cold War paranoia. The anxiety wasn't about the sin of the past, but the terror of the future, the fear shared by the FAS scientists about losing control in a nuclear world. The monster became a symbol of American anxiety, not Japanese pain.
It's just a stunning example of how these trauma narratives get filtered. They become less about the actual historical event and much more about the immediate fears, the politics, the anxieties of the audience that's retelling or consuming the story later on.
So when we look back at our two initial symbols, the Moonlight Boy leading to Get Common and then Godzilla, the synthesis becomes pretty clear, doesn't it? They really do represent profoundly different ways of trying to process an unimaginable national trauma.
Godzilla stands as that primal radioactive scream. Never forget. He's the direct, raw, monstrous embodiment of the destructive sin that science unleashed. He demands remembrance.
Well, Get Common represents the search for a new identity, a borrowed identity, immediate justice. It's the response of assimilation, of mimicry. trying desperately to adopt an external, maybe Western virtue to fill that gaping moral void left by the war and defeat.
And seeing them side by side shows that recovering from something like this, an apocalypse, it's not a single clean path. It's complex, it's contradictory. It involves both that raw rage, that Godzilla scream, and the complicated, sometimes messy adoption of new moral stories, new media figures like Gekko Kamen, even with the problems they bring.
And maybe the final truth is encapsulated in that transformation of Gojira when it crossed the Pacific. The trauma narrative ultimately often tells you more about the fears and the political landscape of the people hearing the story than it does about the original event itself. The bomb created the monster, sure, but it was the dawning Cold War that gave that monster its enduring global meaning.